can get started now.
Okay, done.
Okay, welcome everyone joining us here this morning. This is a webinar of Mass Peace Action and the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign, which is a coalition based right here out of Massachusetts to take on the Raytheon Corporation, Raytheon Technologies, which is based here in Waltham, Massachusetts. It's long been the plan of the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign to use the fact that Raytheon's based here in Massachusetts to localize the story of the war in Yemen and to raise awareness around that war and the suffering of the Yemeni people. So today we have a treat. We're going to get an update on Yemen from two workers from Human Rights Watch, and they're going to let us know what's happening on the ground today in Yemen, and also speak about the risk of the coronavirus and what that might look like in the war-torn country of Yemen. So we'll be getting updates on the war casualties, on the cholera epidemic, which has been a problem for years now, on the threat of famine, and on the role of Saudi Arabia as well. And they will also be giving us recent developments on the battlefield and military situation. We are joined today by Afrah Nasser, who's a Yemen researcher from Human Rights Watch. She's based in Sweden, joining us from Sweden today. And she has been investigating humanitarian law violations and human rights abuses in Yemen. Before joining Human Rights Watch, she was an activist, independent journalist, and analyst reporting on Yemen's social and political changes for over a decade. She is the founding editor of the Sana'a Review. She's from Sana'a originally. We're also joined by Michael Page, who is Deputy Director of the Middle East and North African Division of Human Rights Watch. He's a graduate of the American University of Beirut and the Harvard Kennedy School. He previously worked closely with civil society organizations in the Middle East. And he supervises Human Rights Watch's work on several countries, including Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iran, and Egypt. So we are very happy to be joined by these experts who are going to fill us in on the current situation in Yemen, which will really benefit us greatly and allow us to be more effective advocates and activists around Raytheon and the situation in Yemen. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Michael, who is going to lead us in a presentation and some questioning for Afrah as well. So Michael, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Great. Hey, thanks so much, Brian. And thanks, Paul and Cole, for inviting us on. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you all. And I just want to say, I really do want to say thank you to everyone on this call and the work of Massachusetts Peace Action, because I think it's something to acknowledge is that, there is a lot of difficult and bad news in Yemen right now. We're going to talk about the context for it, but where things have moved from 2015 and 2016 in terms of mobilizing political and popular support to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia from the US due to Saudi Arabia's very serious and repeated violations of the laws of war in Yemen has been something that's tremendous. There is a lot of progress that has been made, and I think there's a tremendous amount of credit that a whole variety of civil society, peace, and human rights organizations have made in that. And so I really want to acknowledge that up front. But I also want to say is that we're moving into a situation in Yemen that, people have used the word catastrophic quite often and for good reason. And so I don't know what is beyond the word catastrophic, but because we're entering something where the dangers and risks are coming at a time where I think there's also a serious preoccupation with all kinds of other very serious issues in the world. And so I think what we want to do, like I want to talk through with Afrah some of the main concerns as we see them and how it relates to the work that you've been doing. And so Afrah, and thank you so much again for the introductions, Brian. Afrah is a longtime researcher and journalist who is now with us at Human Rights Watch, and what we're very thankful for. And Afrah, I say let's start off, with the kind of core question, which is, I think certainly the most pressing issue in Yemen right now, which is the humanitarian situation, but its intersection with COVID-19 crisis, pandemic. Tell us, where are we now with the pandemic in Yemen, with the humanitarian situation, and what's happening?
Thank you, Michael. So just a very brief note. I encourage the audience to send out any questions, any inquiries, anything you want to share, because we really want to keep this as interactive and beneficial to all of us, and it's even more fun. So regarding the most pressing humanitarian issue today in Yemen, it's obviously COVID-19. But when you speak with people inside Yemen, they laugh about this notion, because they have been suffering and enduring so many other outbreaks for more than 5 years now. So basically, the country has been in this trauma since mid 2014, when Houthis took control of the capital. Ever since, all the institutions, all the medical facilities, all the normal life that civilians used to have is not there anymore. So COVID-19 for the people inside Yemen, it seems like like a black comedy. But we have been documenting in Human Rights Watch an exaggerated or like a devastated humanitarian crisis, exaggerated by so many violations of laws of war. And as if like the humanitarian crisis or the devastating conflict is not enough, now COVID-19 would be a casualty, would be unstoppable and so deadly that we can't even imagine. So even prior to the conflict, the healthcare system in Yemen was not one of the best in the world. Yemen for so many years was ranked as the poorest Arab nation. But under the ongoing conflict, more than half of Yemen's health facilities are closed or partially functioning. So since 2015, the parties to the conflict have systematically targeted not only the medical facilities with bombings, but also like medical personnel. So as health workers or people working in hospitals or in clinics, they have been threatened, injured, abducted, detained, and sometimes even killed. This is well documented by, a partner organization, for example, like Muwatana or even Yemen Archive. So consequently, many medical professionals today have fled Yemen, or they are like in a capacity where they can't even respond to the already outbreaks that took place over the past 2 years, or even COVID-19. So the healthcare system is ravaged by the war. So this means that civilians are facing COVID with no sources, with no capacity to respond. So even like countries like the US or Italy or Spain, like democracies and countries with good economy, were not able to confront or combat COVID-19. So how would a country like Yemen, with no health facilities, can combat COVID-19? And what is very, very troubling, that with so many humanitarian organizations, workers that I speak to, they tell me like, we thought that the announcement of COVID-19 outbreak in Yemen would deter the warring parties to cooperate with us or facilitate our work, but in the contrary. So the relief and humanitarian organization report that it would be impossible to respond to the needs that COVID-19 will emerge in the face of fighting and armed groups continuing to block the access to humanitarian aid or humanitarian work. So it seems to me that the civilians are caught between two evils. So you have the war and COVID-19. It's just it's hell. It's like living in hell.
Afrah, can I ask for the audience, how many, just keep us up to date, how many cases do we know about? How many deaths do we know about? And in terms of, you brought up the humanitarian situation, what is the story? You know, the US has been one of the largest, if not, I think the largest provider of humanitarian aid, although that's come with much greater amount of money in terms of weapons given to Saudi Arabia. So it kind of largely cancels out, or definitely cancels out, the kind of humanitarian donation. But what's the situation now in terms of the cases and in terms of the US aid assistance to?
So since the beginning of this month, there was, like in the beginning of this month, one case was reported. And I even I started to think that we need to deal with the situation in Yemen with the assumption that an outbreak has already happened, because you have all the factors where an outbreak could happen. No health care system, no water, no clean water. People are in extreme poverty level. So all the factors were there. But just last night, the both authorities in the north and in the south announced that so approximately now in total, there are 6 cases of COVID-19 confirmed, and 2 deaths of 2 people died of COVID-19 in Aden. And unfortunately, I've seen a report last night that there is already 1 hospital closing in the south because they lack the resources to run the hospital or combat COVID-19 cases that could come to them. So, and at the same time, since 2017, Yemen is regarded by the UN as the largest humanitarian crisis, with more than 20 million people in Yemen are experiencing food insecurity, and 10 million of them are at risk of famine. So an estimate of 90% of the population, so about 25 million people, require some form of humanitarian or protection assistance. And at the same, there are about 4 million people are internally displaced. And these groups in specific are the most vulnerable one, because basically they live with nothing. And guess what? As the US government is one of the largest donors to Yemen, just recently, the Secretary Pompeo announced they are going to suspend aid going to Yemen following some complaints or some obstacles they got from the Houthi authorities in the north. And you have to understand that most of the population, so a large number of Yemen's population, the 30 million population, live in the north. So that means that the majority of people in Yemen will be deprived of aid funds or aid coming from organizations being funded by the US. And I spoke with, for example, with Oxfam, where they told me they tried to negotiate with Houthis that this is not the right way for them to allow humanitarian work, or to make obstacles in the face of humanitarian workers. And they also tried to convince the US government, represented by the USAID, that this is not even the right time to block aid to Yemen with COVID-19 emerging. And nobody's listening. Neither the Houthis want to show serious steps or action to facilitate humanitarian groups' work, and neither the US government is allowing or resuming the aid. And just 2 days ago, the UN came out with like harrowing report saying that about 80% of their programs are going to be suspended because of lack of funding. So a lot of regimes, not only the US, a lot of countries, a lot of states are dealing with their own humanitarian situation back home. And that means they are prioritizing their own humanitarian situation and forgetting about Yemen. And that's devastating, especially for the IDPs. Devastating.
And Afrah, if I could just add, I think it's something like what's been announced is something like over $70 million in cuts that the US is making, I believe, and it's also caught up, as we're all aware, with this other debate with the World Health Organization and US accusations that they have kind of covered up for China. But what's the practical impact is going to be Yemenis who are now facing this crisis completely alone, essentially after the US and the Saudi-led coalition has supported this campaign that has devastated the health infrastructure, along with other parties to the conflict, including the Houthis, who have also targeted health workers and humanitarian workers. Now we have a reality in which they are cutting aid at a time where they desperately need it. So I think we want to leave that there, but I think there's also a note where there is a potential to push. I know this is also part of the political debate in the US. There are Democratic leaders that have been criticizing this in terms of this, aid cut at this time. And so I think that's something that we can talk about further. But I also want to turn, so the humanitarian situation is one, but it's obviously been exacerbated by the arms sales. And Afrah, maybe you could just give I'll add to this, but just a very brief kind of note of where do we think we are globally on the kind of arms sales question to Saudi Arabia in the Yemen conflict?
So it's very important to combine Saudi Arabia and the UAE because in practical, the Saudi Arabia and the UAE are the Saudi-UAE coalition. So since the beginning of the war, Human Rights Watch has done tremendous work in documenting indiscriminate attacks done by the Saudi-led coalition. And in several reports, Human Rights Watch has investigated the remnants of these weapons. And we have seen how some of them are manufactured in the US and UK and other European countries as well. So let me start with the European aspect, and then we go to the US. So since the conflict began, or since the Saudi-led coalition military operation started in March 2015, the only improvement, or let's say the only mini victory that happened in terms of stopping arms sales that are going to, harm civilians, is that the death of Jamal Khashoggi. So despite, the harrowing and heinous murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but it made international or European, especially European states to mobilize each other and start to rethink of the human rights record of Saudi Arabia in specific. And that included also Yemen. So a lot of states from European countries temporarily suspended their arms sales, but all over this time, nothing, no improvement from the US or the White House. We have seen a lot of movements in the Congress, especially led by, Bernie Sanders and Chris Murphy and others, where so many efforts trying to stop the U.S. arms sales, but every time the President Donald Trump was, there vetoing these resolutions. Even in European countries today, there seems to be, they forgot about Jamal Khashoggi, and actually COVID-19 and the global economic collapse would be an incentive for a lot of countries to resume these arms deals. So, for instance, you have today Canada resumed their arm deals with Saudi Arabia, and you can only read it with, or interpret this with, states wanting to protect their own economy, or seeing they see arm deals as a lucrative business.
Afrah, thanks for that. I'm also seeing some really good questions and interesting questions that I want to address in Q&A, and we'll defer to Brian and Paul on kind of managing that. But I do want to turn, I think the kind of note on arms sales is that, what I would want to share with the group is that it is still a component and an important component within this question. Even the kind of the discussions of ceasefires, right, in which the Saudi Arabia has said, oh, we are supporting a unilateral ceasefire throughout the month of Ramadan. They recently announced, but there's still airstrikes that are going on in Yemen. And I do think the pressure to sell weapons will be something that we will see in the kind of wake of this global economic crisis, also caused by the COVID-19 crisis. So it's something to watch. It's something to consider. And the Trump administration has so far been able to continue to veto efforts in terms of U.S. military support. And even as of last year, I'm kind of looking, I was looking before this call, there's several $1 billion of arms sales still kind of on the table in various forms to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And I think while I haven't seen any kind of recent active notifications to Congress, it is a core issue. So I want to flag that it continues to be important. However, and I think this is where we want to turn to Afrah as our kind of last set of points and then open it up for questions. The situation really has changed quite drastically, since 2015, in which there was, a relatively clear narrative regarding Yemen and the Saudi-led coalition. And now I think I saw in one of the Q&A questions, there's a lot of fragmentation. Can you talk, Afrah, given the complexity, can we just start with what is the state of these announcements of ceasefires, number one, and number two, give us the kind of sense of what is the military situation on the ground. And then I think it would be useful that we turn to Brian and Paul to kind of manage some of the more specific questions, because I think they're good to address, individually. So Afrah, can you share that for us?
All right. So the ceasefire is just a joke. So we have seen since Saudi Arabia announced that it's going to have a unilateral ceasefire, bombings, despite the announcement, bombings still continued. They're mainly in the north, so they're still fighting the Houthis. And also there are other multi-fronts where the Houthis are trying to have military advancement in Taiz, in Hodeidah, and in Marib. So the war is still raging, despite reports about the ceasefire. Till when, if the fake, let's say the fake announcement or the flawed ceasefire, it will end by the end of Ramadan. Maybe by the end of Ramadan, we can hear some outcomes of talks between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis. So I guess this is what Saudi Arabia is trying to do at the same time. But it's very, very important to note that the Saudi-led coalition has changed since it was established in 2015. So today you have Saudi Arabia, both separately, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, funding their own proxy local forces on the ground. And we in Human Rights Watch have been, trying to investigate what these proxy forces are also doing, because their funders are also complicit in these abuses. So, for example, you have in the south different militia groups funded by the UAE and even running secret detention center. And just recently, we in Human Rights Watch investigated Saudi forces with their own proxy or allied Yemeni forces in Al-Mahra, which is in the east of Yemen, very remote from where Houthis are. They're running secret detention centers, at least one secret detention center. So obviously, the end goals for the Saudi Arabia and the UAE is very different from where they started the war, because they started the war with the idea that they will restore the legitimacy of Yemeni President Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi. But what we in Human Rights Watch have been monitoring with these abusive practices by allied UAE forces and Saudi forces is very, very troubling. And they are responsible of detention, torture, enforceable disappearance of indefinite number of people. So, and this is one thing that I think we need to link with COVID-19, that it's so troubling that today in Yemen we have a pattern of detention centers and we don't know how many detainees are there and what is the health situation for them. And that's by itself is very cruel. And I think what the war will go on with, that we will see more fragmentation and more militia groups doing more heinous practices.
Afrah, that's great. And I want to turn it over to kind of Paul, because I saw some really good questions. But just the one note I'd like to emphasize from Afrah's point is that, we're a human rights organization focused on abuses, and we've also focused on the intersection between COVID-19 and rights abuses. And one thing that we really want to draw on is that in conflicts, especially, detention centers are atrocious, but they're also centers for spreading COVID-19. I mean, unfortunately, that's the story not just in Yemen, but in the United States. And so in Yemen, where there is even less oversight, less support, I think it would not shock me is that if the pandemic continues to spread across Yemen, detention centers play an unfortunate role in that spread, because it's all of the kind of worst things that we know from a public health perspective about overcrowding, lack of sanitation, lack of access to good health. And so that's a very serious concern, especially since all parties of the conflict, Saudi Arabia, UAE, their proxies, the Houthis, have all been involved in a horrific kind of archipelago of detentions across the country. I'd like to stop. Thank you so much, Afrah. I'd like to stop there and turn over to kind of Paul and Brian in terms of how they want to manage some of these questions. And we're really excited about, addressing them in more detail.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Michael. Just a quick question, Afrah, on the Saudi UAE alliance. There have been a lot of reports that has fractured, and that the UAE, some reports are that the UAE has pulled out, but that they're not working with the Saudis anymore. Could you give us your thoughts on that situation?
So the UAE doesn't tell the whole truth usually, but they never said that they left the Saudi-led coalition. Yes, they withdrew their troops in Yemen, but they never said, actually they said we're still part of the Saudi-led coalition, which is true, because they are still funding different security groups. The one that comes to my mind, the Security Belt, which is very famous now today, and also the STC, the Southern Transitional Council. is fully funded by the UAE. So even though Emirati troops left Yemen, but UAE influence is still there. To what extent the alliance between the Saudi-led coalition, the Saudi Arabia and the UAE is still there? I mean, I cannot speak especially on this on behalf of Human Rights Watch, but in my personal view, I think there is a rift between both of them. They're not coming in terms of so many things. For instance, the STC is funded by the UAE, and Saudi Arabia is not happy about their work in the south. So it seems like, you know, both are not in the same page in how they want to do things in the south. Yeah, that's in brief.
Afrah, could you kind of clarify the situation? People aren't too familiar with the battlefield situation in terms of which groups are where. And, you know, we know something about the Houthis, but we don't know much about all these different groups and who's controlling which areas and how the battles are going on the ground. You know, are the Houthis losing out on the ground? Are they gaining? Who's fighting where? These types of questions of what the lay of the land is in the country in terms of the military situation.
The internal dynamics need separate 1 hour, I guess. But let me put it very simply. So let's divide Yemen today into 3. So this is how I see it. There is main 3 parts: the north, the south, and the east, which each has their own authority today. So in the north, you have the de facto authority, that's the Houthis. In the south, there is a mixture of SDC and other groups, and the UAE has a huge influence also there. And then you have the east, where actually, yeah, it's also a mixture of what survived, the political parties that survived Houthi abuses or escaped to other parts and can't find their place with UAE influence. So that mainly is the Islah political party, and other groups. Also, there is an Omani influence in Al Mahra, for example. Hadramaut is still, they run their own resources, and they have alliance with the Yemeni government and also the Saudi-led coalition. So this is the 3 main parts. Houthis today, the main or the key potential battle today is going to be from Houthi going to Marib, wanted to take all the north. And Marib is a very strategic point because it has one of the very limited oil and petroleum resources in Yemen, in Marib. So they have like economic and commercial ambition in taking Marib. So today, some of the discussion about the political deal is that they're trying to see how to divide Yemen, basically. But Saudi Arabia in particular, many times have said that they want a unified Yemen. The Southern Transitional Council in the south wants independence and have been working for independence for so many years. Not in particular the STC, but the movement in itself. They lack international support. So just last night, the UN Security Council published or issued a statement saying that they support a unified Yemen. So this is the main clash, where you have like the fragmented Yemen born out of the conflict, but there is an international political decision to keep Yemen united. And this is where the clash has happened. That's simple. Yes, Michael, please.
Could I just add to that Paul, just is that Afrah did such a great job of kind of laying out what is, in these types of extended conflicts, this is just kind of a natural result, is that you have an eventual fragmentation of society because of just facing the brunt of what has been a brutal and abusive set of kind of military confrontation. And what Afrah is really laying out is that, unfortunately, despite COVID-19 and despite the reality that, many of us are in some form of lockdown, and that's what should be happening in a place like Yemen, which has zero, backstop in terms of a health infrastructure. I think what she's pointing to is that there are very clear incentives for the fight to continue. And, one of the areas she referenced in Maghreb that she has brought up is that there are hundreds of thousands of internally displaced persons, and we don't need to be public health experts to understand the very serious implications if there is more mass displacement in that situation. And so one of the takeaways is that in a reality such as this, we would want substantial and substantive international support for finding some kind of means to end this conflict, just given the health realities. And unfortunately, particularly with the Trump administration, but even before, that's simply not there. And even though, one other thing that you might see referenced in the news is that oil prices have crashed. And so countries like Saudi Arabia have incentives to not be spending millions of dollars in Yemen. And that is true. But, according to many analysts, they don't have much of a way out. And it's of their own making, right? They've created, and the coalition has created, a disastrous reality that, unfortunately, like many conflicts that, the US has been a part of, or other countries, they now have great difficulty of extricating themselves from it. And so that's the situation that they're in. And so it's a lot of complexity, but at its core, it's a very simple question of, you need overwhelming political and diplomatic international support for kind of engaging with the various actors to find some kind of solution. That is not present, and you don't even have the political and financial will to give what is needed in Yemen to just support efforts of COVID-19. And so that's a grim reality, but that is the reality.
Thanks for clarifying that, Michael and Afrah. Let's switch to this these disastrous results already from the war. We've been using the figure that 85,000 children had starved to death in Yemen. I think that was from Save the Children. What level of hunger deaths, what level of deaths from the fighting? How about the cholera epidemic that was so critical a year ago? What are the updates on these things? Do we have any good figures about how many Yemenis have been killed by the bombings and by the war, of how many deaths there are by the famine? Have these things increased in scope over the past year or so? Have there been some amelioration? Does the cholera epidemic still rage? Those types of questions.
Okay, that's so many questions, but I'll try to just put them in one basket and say that the humanitarian situation never got better. Never. It's only like, if the numbers are changing, it's only because the situation and the impacted communities are getting hit and getting worse and larger. Regarding cholera in specific, according to the UN, that there has been some improvement because of an international aid that was going to contain the outbreak. But does it make any difference that now with COVID-19 outbreak is there? I mean, you have to look at the COVID-19 could be like a joint suicide for everyone. So even the warring parties themselves, for example, like the Houthis, given that they have connection with the Iranians, can you imagine with me if they are also going to get the virus from some Iranian contacts? visiting Yemen or them going and seeing them somewhere. I mean, this is what I wish the warring parties can truly understand. If cholera outbreak was contained, COVID-19 will not, and it will directly impact themselves and their families. It will be massive, uncontrollable. يعني, given, يعني, if you think, like, if you think of what COVID-19 can do in Yemen, the cholera will seem like nothing. So this is what I just need the international community and international organization to really rally and try to use this moment to tell warring parties to end the suffering of people and civilians. Michael, please.
Only to add is that even things such as the cholera epidemic, and as recently, in January, I think I saw in the New York Times about 110,000 cases. It's been exacerbated by what has been Yemen's kind of torrential rains, and it's only I think the reason that you're hearing from us an almost hesitation about specific figures is that likely the ability to keep up with the quantitative disaster that is Yemen is difficult now, but the trend line is incredibly negative, and all of the things such as, for instance, cholera and the kind of exacerbated by floods. Just imagine a situation where infrastructure is only continuing to both either deteriorate because of a lack of investment or deteriorate because fighting continues to actively destroy it. And so I think that's the kind of overall kind of issue. And then in terms of the kind of general casualties, again, I think it's something that it's not something that Human Rights Watch has a specialization in, but I also think it's something where groups such as Yemen Data Project and others try to keep track on kind of total number of casualties, total number of airstrikes. But
so about more than 200 according to the Yemen Data Project, about more than 200,000 people have died, and the number is slightly higher, especially with the spread of diseases and the closure of airports where patients with serious diseases cannot leave the country to get the right medical care. So the number is unquantifiable. Actually, we cannot really have an estimate.
Okay, thank you. I understand that. It just sounds so catastrophic. There are a few questions about, there are reports that the Houthis have been more accommodating to international supervision of aid. Someone mentions someone named Lisa Grain of CSIS, saying that the Houthis have been more accommodating to providing accountability for WFP food aid going in. And then another question related to the aid is the U.S. also pressuring the UN to cut aid, in addition to cutting its own aid, its own humanitarian aid?
I honestly did not investigate both issues. What I know, Lisa Grande is running a very, very challenging situation. I could see in social media there is anger, frustration towards the UN, not only Lisa Grande, but even Martin Griffith, the UN Special Envoy. And I do understand why people are so mad and they don't see any improvement in the situation. So yeah, just in brief, I didn't investigate those issues, so I can't comment. Maybe Michael, you want to say something?
Well, only to say that Paul, to kind of go back to the first point, which is we're in a situation where there has been very clear documentation on the Houthis redirecting, obstructing, restricting aid, which are all violations of international humanitarian law, and that is layered on a reality in which the Saudi-led coalition blockade also continues to restrict access. And for both parties, in a reality that is COVID-19, you would hope that cynicism wouldn't abound, in that continued behavior patterns that are abuses, but that seems to be the reality. And that's been part of the discussion on the larger ceasefire issue, is that Houthis have adopted, or what analysts would call maximalist positions, including ending the blockade, et cetera. But those are critical humanitarian issues that, particularly in the reality of a potential pandemic with a decimated health infrastructure, people should be pressuring the Saudi-led coalition to do, while also upholding it. I think the reality is that while the U.S. government is in there referencing of oh, well, we're cutting this aid because of Houthi behavior, there is a basis in fact about the behavior itself, while not necessarily that being the reason for their process, for their actual kind of intentions to do that. And I think the kind of feedback from humanitarians that has been shared with Afrah is overwhelmingly is that no matter what kind of leverage or pressure you're trying to get upon the Houthis, now is not the time to be cutting humanitarian and aid to WHO and for emergency medical supplies in a pandemic. I mean, it's beyond, again, without having special expertise, it's not rocket science to not do that, but that is the reality. And so that is why there is a drawdown of programs, because there's insufficient funding.
Okay, well, thank you for clarifying that. You've mentioned the Saudi blockade. We're familiar with Saudi bombing and support for various groups in funding of different groups, military groups in Yemen, but we're not very familiar with this blockade. What is that about, and what's involved in that?
So since 2015, I guess it was in August 2015, Saudi-led coalition decided to suspend all flights going to Sana'a airport and any other airports in Yemen. With time, especially when they freed the south, let's say, when they moved Houthi out of the south, the airport in Aden was open. Even seaports are under the control of the Saudi-led coalition forces. Today there is a battle in Hodeidah. Hodeidah is still under the control of Houthis, and this is one issue they're fighting over also. And the blockade has been responsible of countless human rights abuses against innocent civilians, and especially sick people who needed urgent medical attention to fly out of Yemen. So it's, Human Rights Watch, other human rights groups have been calling over and over to lift the blockade, in specific of the one in Sana'a, with, and nobody listened to these calls. So till today, Saudi-led coalition is, enforcing blockade against Sana'a airport, and that has had devastating impact, actually. You're muted, Paul.
Sorry, Afrah. Is there a naval blockade as well?
Yeah. That's what I meant with the seaport, the naval blockade also. It's not only the Saudi-led coalition that controls some of the seaports, but also there are reports by, investigative journalists from CNN and AP and others, where US personnel, American personnel also helping, and European organization, European governments also helping the Saudi run these seaports. So a lot of actors are actually involved in this blockade.
So could you go into that a little bit more then, in terms of what information you have about specific involvement of the United States itself with the Saudis? What type of support are they providing the Saudis? How significant is that support? What should people in the United States focus on in terms of trying to end this horrendous situation?
Maybe Michael can also help me with this. What we do know that since the Saudi-led coalition began its military campaign in Yemen, American, the U.S. has been helping these strikes with logistic and intelligence assistance for a big part of time. The US was also refueling war jets, Saudi and UAE war jets hovering over Yemen. Just recently, they stopped refueling after congressional effort, they stopped refueling the war jets. But we do know that there is still American assistance with logistic and intelligence going to the Saudi-led coalition. Michael?
Just to add is that Yemen is a country that relies greatly on imports, including imports for fuel and food. The blockade slows down and restricts those ability for imports, and a lot of the previous rounds of negotiations between the UN, the Saudi-led coalition, and the Houthis was around Hodeidah port and the ability to have some kind of independent entity that kind of oversees it, and then that to allow actually greater delivery. And as Afrah is saying, it's not just the naval blockade, it's a total kind of closure on the airspace in Yemen, which has meant that, for instance, for a while, rights groups and humanitarian groups have pushed for the Saudi Arabia to actually allow medical flights, for instance, to relieve wounded people from Sana'a to seek medical treatment. And instead, what has happened is that for years is that people have had to make perilous journeys from northern Yemen to airports in Aden in order to kind of travel for medical assistance. Obviously now, in the wake of COVID-19 and what is largely kind of a global, a lot of global restrictions in terms of travel, that makes it even more difficult. And so that overall closure, and again, kind of update to 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic, is something that is devastating for a country in the need of essentially everything in terms of humanitarian supplies. And so that's why there should be a push, or renewed push, as part of kind of these discussions around ceasefire to kind of ease the blockade. But it should be noted, and this is the complicated, issue in terms of conflict situations, is that there has been, a solid documentation around Houthis obstructing aid, and stealing aid, as well as kind of using particularly fuel on the black market as part of their kind of funding of their own war effort. And so those complexities make things challenging, but it's also something in which the people who pay the price are the civilians on the ground that absolutely need aid more than ever.
Okay, thank you. Recently, the Secretary General of the UN has called for an international ceasefire everywhere because of the pandemic. Do you see any hope coming out of that in terms of putting pressure on especially outside parties, people who are not Yemenis, to this conflict, actually having to respond to that call?
I think ceasefire without a political pressure will not do anything. So even the ceasefire was not fully implemented. So only the Saudi Arabia said that they will, that they welcome the ceasefire and they will do it, and they announced that they are doing ceasefire, but it's still flawed. The Houthis did not accept the Saudi offer. But at the same time, without any political pressure from key allies, such as in the US, in the White House, the UK government, if Iran is not convinced, these allies, if they're not pressuring the warring parties on the ground in Yemen, no ceasefire will, have any outcome, any positive outcome. Michael?
Only to say is that there are military, there's a lot of an industry of Yemen analysis, some of which is good, some of which may be less good, but I think that the fundamental point is that there are key incentives for people to pursue, actors on the ground to pursue a continuation of the military conflict, particularly with the Houthis in Ma'rib, but as well in terms of for Saudi Arabia led coalition to continue a blockade and restrictions, and in the south for there to be maneuvering between parties, between particularly the Yemeni government on one hand that the Saudi government supports, and the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council, Transitional Council, which has kind of announced that they are. They announced their own kind of self-rule in Aden and other southern parts. So I mean, that takes, Paul, you referenced the UN kind of global ceasefire, and I think there hopefully, I think there's some recognition of the very seriousness and blowback effects on COVID-19, right? There's no restrictions on borders. It affects fighters as much as it affects, elderly people or, civilians, but without political will and pressure from the international community, that is likely not to be effective and successful. And currently, again, speaking really as just from my own personal perspective, it doesn't seem like that will is there, particularly from key actors like the US and the UK that are actually embroiled in their own kind of somewhat, let's diplomatically problematic management of the COVID-19 situation in their own countries. And so that I think has just kind of weakened overall the focus and lack of attention, on a place like Yemen. And so I think it's destined to be that way. And I think where there is space for activist groups, to really, make a difference is to be speaking out on the humanitarian situation, to be speaking out and trying to make known the importance of the cuts that are being made, and to say, hey, this is an issue for my local representatives, et cetera. This is something that needs to be pushed. I mean, it's not like the Trump administration has complete control over all branches. US Congress, in the House in particular, has a voice in matters regarding budget, and there's a discussion to be had and to push on that, and then I think on the UN side, I think, while I hope success, I think this is where I see a great difficulty without tremendous pressure, and I hope to be wrong about that. I hope we were wrong about that, but I don't think we are.
Okay, well, maybe we have time for one more question, Brian, do you think? We have someone who's working, I don't have their name here, for an amendment to the NDAA, the military budget, to push for a report on U.S. personnel actually helping the Saudis with the blockade. What the nature of U.S. personnel helping the Saudis with the blockade is. Do you have any information about that in terms of the collaboration to implement the blockade between U.S. personnel and the Saudis?
I can find the reports. Yeah, so I can find the link and share it with whoever, or even with you, Paul, and you can give it to the person who asked the question. Okay, so we'll get that information out. Michael, did you have anything to add?
Only to say, I want to appreciate your time, and for all of you for joining, and especially, in month 2 or whatever this is, time it's kind of lost some of its the meaning, and to say that there really is in a world where we are feeling like seemingly awash in crises, this actually does have a U.S. angle. While the arms sales will continue to be an issue, and I think it's something to watch, I would say that this is something to watch and monitor. I think the priority is the humanitarian situation that Afrah has really laid out in really great detail, and the pushing of a U.S. positive role, particularly and at the very least, not being so totally self-defeating in terms of their own cuts at such a critical time in terms of the intersection between an ongoing humanitarian crisis and a global pandemic that we now know are cases in Yemen. We know there are deaths in Yemen. And as we, at least I speak from the kind of American side, have very personally experienced, we see what happens, what exponential growth means, and the difference between documented cases and what likely is circulating. And so I think that is something that really needs to be at the forefront of all of our minds, but also speaking out publicly.
I just want to say lastly, because I have to catch a train, so I'm sorry, like I have to, in Sweden we still travel inside the country, so relax. I just want to say that I'm very thankful for this webinar, because I think it's very, very important to keep, raising awareness. Some of the things that this administration does not like, the public to know about is that credible facts. So it's so important to raise awareness. So I'm very grateful for Peace Action. And I think there is a lot to do for Yemen. But one thing that you can do in the US is really to pressure your representatives to pressure, that the US role is to be not destructive, to be as positive as possible in Yemen. That's just in simple words.
Thank you, Afrah. Brian?
Sure. First of all, I want to thank Afrah and Michael for your time and for that great presentation. It really helps to be more educated on these subjects. As I said earlier, it makes us better activists and better advocates for our cause. I see another question from Diana. Will you be sharing messaging and actions? That was for us at Mass Peace. And I want to say yes, absolutely. You will all be getting a follow-up email with a recording of this webinar and also some action steps that you can take and upcoming events. I want to be clear that this is a project of the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign. So it's not just Mass Peace Action. It's so many coalition members. The Friends Meeting at Cambridge, Peace and Social Justice Committee, American Friends Service Committee, United Against War and Militarism, student groups at Boston University, at MIT, at Northeastern, the Veterans for Peace, Waltham Concerned Citizens, Committee for Peace, Human Rights, Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, and some that I'm forgetting, I'm sure. So that is one action step that you can take is to officially join the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign and Coalition, and we will be sending out a way for you to do that in our follow-up email. A couple other things that I would like you to know about. We have an upcoming webinar on Thursday, May 7th at 7 p.m. That's going to feature former Army Major Danny Scherzen, turned peace activist, who has just written a fantastic article about the influence of the military-industrial complex, including Raytheon, their ties to the Secretary of Defense, and those at the highest levels of the U.S. government. So what we're doing at the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign is really targeting those that are profiting from the situation that you just heard about in Yemen, to make that connection between Massachusetts and a country that for so many of us seems very far away on the other side of the world. And there's one final thing that I wanted to leave you with. I'm going to share my screen for this. We have made up some fantastic yard signs. In the time of social distancing, we're not able to get together and gather and demonstrate, but this is a way to publicly voice your opposition to Raytheon and encourage them to use their technical expertise to do something good, something positive instead of something destructive and negative. So we've had a few dozen of these are being printed up right now. And for those in the Boston area, we will be asking if you would like a sign delivered to your house. So we can keep this issue in people's minds visibly. So even during COVID-19, even during shelter in place, we can continue to make this issue heard and seen. So we will be sending you a follow-up email with those steps and opportunities. And we hope everyone today joins the Raytheon anti-war campaign. And thank you, Afrah and Michael, for your expertise. We really appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll be seeing you again in the future. So thanks,
Hopefully,
everyone.
with more good news.
Yes,
That would be
yes,
good.
it would, it would.
Let us know when you have some. We'll put you on.
Absolutely. So we want to wish everyone the best in this time. Everybody stay safe and stay active. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you all soon. Peace to you all.